She'd get on the loudspeaker and say, "Brad, get off the runway, there's a plane coming in." And so I'd pull my tricycle off from the runway, watch the plane come down and land, then I'd get back on the runway.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
It's another great day in Dixie. Great for many reasons. One reason is that I have Brad Stucki in the studio with myself and Ricky today to talk about some really special and important and wonderful things about his father and mother and family and their impact on this area. It's also wonderful because both Brad and I got wet as we came in here today.
Yeah, it's raining. That's momentous.
It's actually raining. And that's a great feeling, especially right in the middle of summer. It smells good and feels good. But Brad, it's so good to have you here today. I've been really looking forward to the chance to talk to you about your father, Bruce Stucki, and of course your mother, who's such an important part of all of this, Cheryl, and get a sense of what I've always known, which is that Bruce Stucki played major roles in so many key ventures and developments and enterprises in this area. But I've never really heard a lot of the detail or the stories.
He always liked to be low-key. He really was that way.
He was low-key. But if you look back to the 1960s and 70s, those really transitional years in our community, he was in the middle of so many awesome things. He did all of that, like you say, almost behind the scenes. But then later, he became a general authority in the church and was a member of the Second Quorum of the 70. And he passed away how long ago?
He passed away when he was 81, so he's been gone about 6 years.
6 years. And he was a general authority emeritus at that time and beloved throughout our community. I know so many people who were the beneficiaries of his ministering, his personal ministering.
I have people come up to me all the time and just relate a brief story of what he did and how he did it. And no one ever knew, but...
Yeah, that's awesome. Brad, why don't we drop back, because it's so fun in these podcasts to get the context of how all these awesome things come together, and most of them start somewhere far away with a family that made its way to Dixie, and in your case, your ancestors, many ancestors, made their way to Dixie in different ways. Bring that together with the Stucki family. Your mom is a Cox, the Cox family, which is legendary in this community, and share some of that.
All right. The Stucki side of the family originated in a little community that I can't pronounce near Bern, Switzerland. And they joined the church along with Hafens and Fries and Gublers and so on. And they came across the pond. And my particular family was part of the handcart pioneers. And John S. Stucki has a history that he wrote, and one of the stories was quoted in General Conference by one of the general authorities talking about the handcart pioneers and how they had a side of beef or a big roast of beef, and the young John S. was walking behind, and he was just so hungry that he would carve off a little piece from his pocket knife and chew on it and so on. And then when his father, at the end of a long day, noticed how much was gone, he thought he was going to get a licking, but his father just cried and just said, "That's okay, I understand." So,
he was, maybe 10 years old?
About 10 years old. He was helping push the handcart.
That story always brings tears to my eyes, how that little boy, how hungry he must have been, and how maybe scared or terrorized he was that he was going to be punished.
Oh, yeah. He was going to get a licking, he was sure.
But his father had that compassion for him. And then they were eventually called to settle Santa Clara,
And they first lived in a dugout for several years. And the family started to grow, and the homestead property is still there, which is part of the Heritage Park that's in Santa Clara now.
That is such a wonderful development in Santa Clara, that that's your family heritage land there.
Yeah, we had the corrals there, and actually it was the first station for the first dock for Rocky Mountain Service when it first started back in the early 30s.
We're going to get into that in a minute. That's awesome.
On my mother's side, as a Cox, the earliest recollections I have is Mom talking about my grandfather Cox, Emerald, and Elsie, who was a Burgess, and then Ma and Pa Burgess, who were up in Mountain Meadow and lived in Mountain Meadows for a time, and then Central, and then back into St. George. But the Coxes came up from Bunkerville in Nevada, and then settled up into St. George. And Emerald started and operated the Apex mine for many years.
That's awesome. I can't stop thinking about John Stucki and them living in that dugout, and it was probably right in that same area where the park is now, in the side of the hill. Yeah. From a personal standpoint, I live right at the top of that hill. I look down off that hill right off my back porch, and I'm not haunted by it. It's always there in my mind. I know what I'm looking at there, and I know that it's sacred. Another great story about John is, in those first few years, they were hungry.
Oh, yeah.
They were getting by on carrot greens and beet greens and whatever they could concoct something to eat. And that story about him walking all the way to Washington.
And working and then keeping food in his pocket to take back to his family.
He would go over there and work for a family that had some flour and some ability to make bread and some other kind of foodstuffs. And then at the end of the week, he would walk back to Santa Clara with some food for his family. It's just amazing to think about those times and juxtapose them to the life we live.
Oh, yeah. We're the beneficiaries of a lot of sacrifice and dedication.
So those folks, the Stuckis and all those other Swiss folks in Santa Clara, they were really good at growing fruit, vegetables, and other things. And out of that grew something really, in the beginning it was simple, and they would put their peaches in wagons and take them to Pioche and to the other mining areas.
They got really good at marketing their produce.
Yeah. But out of that, something really great grew that still exists.
Yes, it does.
Okay. Take us through that.
Yes. Again, in the early 30s, Harvey Stucki, my father's father, and a group of 7 other families in Santa Clara started produce and trucking company. A lot of the farmers and growers and so on had peddled and joined up, and in fact, even the Whitwers, that was my grandmother was a Whitwer, and peddled produce around the area. But Harvey and these other families got together and brought in one of the first commercial trucks into the area. And so they started Rocky Mountain Service, they called it, headquartered in Santa Clara on the homestead ground. They built a little dock there, and they got together with the other growers, and they started marketing for them. And they became kind of a wholesaler of produce. And they operated that for a number of years, and then they got to a point where they had enough trucks. At that point, they had a dock in Las Vegas and a dock in L.A. because they started to expand and brought produce in from L.A. and so on to go a larger area. It wasn't just the local area. Then it became like into Vegas and over into Kanab and Page, up as far as Fillmore, and so on, and started routes up the Zion National Park and out into Lincoln County in Nevada. And so they grew that business, and it got to the point where some of the partners started a trucking company called Milne Truck Lines.
So Milne Truck Line grew out of Rocky Mountain.
And then they split. And at that time when they split into the 2 companies, my father had just graduated from college, and they had asked him to come back to be the bookkeeper for the company. And this would have been, late 50s, I believe. Dad had graduated from college, and his father had passed away earlier when Dad was 10 years old, and from a brain injury. Hilda, his mother, kind of was working with the other partners, but she'd always have Dad come to the meetings and so on. So he grew up really fast.
And that's great to bring your Grandma Hilda in, because she was a legendary woman in Santa Clara. What a great lady. So her husband, your grandpa, died really quite young. And your dad, maybe that was part of what...
I think it was. He accepted some responsibility quite young and so on, but he bore up under it really well. And then when he came back, they asked him to be the bookkeeper for Rocky Mountain Produce. It had become Rocky Mountain Produce. And they had moved to a dock and area in St. George, just off 400 East, candidly near where I have my office now with the bank. But they were there operating, and when they split to mill and truck lines in Rocky Mountain Produce, Dad bought his mother's share of Rocky Mountain Produce up and allowed her to keep her stock in the mill and truck lines and so on. So that's how he got ownership in the company.
And through those years, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that whole kind of World War II generation, so many people were employed, lots of drivers. A lot of those men who went to the war, they were probably drivers before they left and then after they got home.
It would surprise you, some of the people that drove for Rocky Mountain Produce. And I still have people that'll stop me and say, back in the day, I drove for your dad, and just tell me a story and so on.
That's awesome how that grew out of those beginning years of poverty right there in that very spot, and then became this amazing regional or...
Yeah, it grew to about a $45 to $50 million business annually. And at one time, they were taking care of the produce operations for Walmart in many of the western states, and also the bananas for Costco's. Not a lot of people know that, but when you go to Costco to buy bananas during that period, they were from Rocky Mountain.
And so what, if you trace from there to today, what still exists from that?
Actually, back in the early 2000s, the partners, Dad had been called on a mission, and actually it was back in 1996-ish. Dad was called as a mission president with Mom to England. And the partners at that time, they had decided that they had a good run. All of the others were retired, and Dad was nearing retirement and so on. And so they decided to sell the operating company as well as the real estate holdings of the company. And along the way, throughout the years, with their excess cash, they would buy property. They figured that was a safe place to kind of store their value and excess cash in the company and so on. So they opted to sell. And over that time, between about 1997-ish and 98, and I'm not exactly sure of the dates, although I was there and involved in it, we sold a portion of the company to Cisco Foods and a portion of the company to Nicholas, and then a portion of the company to Stan Gubler's family, which was the Wonder Bread operation and the trucking side of it. Mm-hmm. And they continued to run that. And the reason why they decided to do that, they had the concessions with Costco and Walmart, but it was just very management intensive and so on. And then the competition with the likes of Cisco and Nicholas, St. George and our market was going more and more with national chains, whereas Rocky Mountain's customer base was mainly the, local operators, local owners, and they were dying out. And so they figured it was a good time to sell. And also during that time, I had come back from working in Salt Lake with a development company to come back, and they asked me to work on their developments, their real estate developments. So that's how I had a chance to come back to St. George.
And I want to get into all of that here, but before we leave Rocky Mountain and mill and truck lines, it's just having grown up here in the late 50s and through the 60s, I have a sense of what those companies meant to this community, because so many of my friends, their dads were drivers or they worked somehow in those companies, and they had good jobs. I have that perception that they had good jobs.
Good jobs, living wage kind of a thing, yeah.
you think about what that meant.
There were not a lot of those types of opportunities in the community. Yeah, I remember that.
So that's really awesome. And it goes back to that entrepreneurial can-do spirit that those Swiss people brought to Santa Clara. Brad, you've kind of got us to another jump-off point here. I know that your dad was involved, and you and your family, other family members have been involved in a lot of key developments in the community. And again, some of those are really monumental in the development of our community. Can you walk us through some of those things?
Yeah, I think something that was not ever touted very much, but a company called Dixie Development Company that was formed by a group of local businessmen here in town. And the whole aspect of it began as a nonprofit, and they got together to say, what can we do to bring more businesses to the local area? And so they banded together with their strength and their knowledge and wisdom, and everybody did a little bit of their work. I know Rod Savage was the accountant. Dad handled the banking side of things and the development side of things. And the Jennings, there were a lot of different families, Iverson family, that were all involved because they all believed in trying to bring economic development to southern Utah. And they brought in what was then called the Kellwood companies, and which became American Recreation Products. And they were out in the old industrial park that's on the northeast section of St. George there, and they had a fairly large manufacturing plant that they built through Dixie Development. And how Dixie Development would operate is that they would bring these companies in and work with the city, and the city would give concessions and so on, and then Dad would go to the banks on the strength of the company's lease and basically arranged for financing, which, there were no guarantors. I'm a banker now, and I know how hard that would have been at the time, but they accomplished it. And based on the strength of the lease, they were able to finance the construction, and that building is still owned by Dixie Development today.
And that really was the first industrial park
in the area.
It took that kind of vision and risk.
Yeah, a group of people got together and decided they needed to do it.
Again, I remember Kellwood as a boy, and I remember what that meant.
Yeah.
Friends whose parents worked there,
yeah.
And that it just added to the vibrance of our community in a really important way.
There were several projects that they financed that way and so on. In fact, just as a personal experience, I remember I had come back and started working on the development side for the Rocky Mountain companies and the various investment companies that were tied to it. That Dad took me to a meeting once with the city planner and development planner, and they had called Dad, and they were talking with a company called Quality Park Products. And they were wanting to look, and they wanted Dad to make a pitch on how they could get them a building and how they could have a great rent and so on to be able to locate here in St. George. And so they sat down, and I was there. I was kind of the fly on the wall. And they talked about what they wanted, and Dad said, you can have anything you want, and as long as we can have a lease that would cover the payment on the loan that we'll be able to get. And that's how the deal was struck. And Richard Watts was there as the contractor, and Dad was able to just bring people in, and Richard gave a good deal on the building and so on, so it made it really feasible for them to do it, and that building is still there now as well and part of Dixie Development.
That's awesome. This just came to mind. My dad, way back in the 60s maybe, I'm not sure how, but my dad bought some stock.
In Dixie Development, yeah. That's how they raised the seed money, is they sold stock.
People throughout the community bought stock, and he's 93 now. And just a couple of years ago, he decided to sell that stock. I think it sold back to the company, and I won't give actual figures, but it's astronomical what he put into it and what he got 50 years later.
Yeah, it's actually quite a valuable company now with the assets and so on, but it's still, I know my brother Wayne is on the board, and they're still running it. It still has economic development as a thing, but not as necessarily as aggressive as they were in the past, because there's a lot of economic development funds and things that are taking the place of what Dixie Development was then. And now it's more managing the assets that they've held for the stockholders that originally put in the funds.
It's amazing, though, to think that that entity still exists and the role that it played through all those decades.
Yeah.
And still does. Take us, I'm not sure where to go next. There's so many roads to go down here.
Well,
I mean, Red Cliff's Mall.
Yes. In fact, that's another one I can speak personally about. I was at school at BYU, and I graduated in 1986. It was the summer of 86, and between my starting in the early fall of 86 to get a master's degree at the U, Dad called me up and said, "Hey, I want you to come to a meeting with me." And so I said, sure. He knew I was interested in real estate development, and that's what I was working toward, and so on. And so I got in the truck, and we drove to Salt Lake, and we ended up at the offices of John Price Development. And we went in and sat down with John Price and Rex Frazier. Dad said, I've got this property in St. George that I've got zoned, and I've got the engineering done to bring the roads and so on, which is now Red Cliffs Drive, and the interchange at the end of East St. George Boulevard. The company, Rocky Mountain Company, paid for the engineering for that and so on to get it so that the state would agree to fund it and then set up an SID for the commercial property owners and some of the other property owners that would pay to have the road done. He said, I've got all this done. I've got X amount of acres, and I think this would be an awesome site for a mall. And they looked at it and said, I think you're right, and they started negotiating. And long story short, there were two other sites that people were looking at for malls in St. George at the time. One was just off 400 East, where the old Rocky Mountain terminal was, but now it's the Jennings property now, and then another on the south side of the freeway near the south interchange on South Bluff. And there were two different mall groups that were looking, and property owners were working, and so on. And so it was a race. And Dad and the RMC, they called it RMC Mall Corp. There were, basically it was the Rocky Mountain Company partners and their families. And so they struck the deal and started doing the work on the mall.
So you can trace Red Cliff's Mall all the way back to Santa Clara and the little dock right there.
That's right, yeah. The outgrowth of that.
That's amazing. And again, that was a huge step in our community. We had a mall, and that's one of those
That was a turning point.
seminal points in a community.
You got a Walmart and a mall.
And it's still there, and it's still a thriving.
Yeah, it's past John Price Development. We were partners in the mall with John Price. And then when John got called as an ambassador, and I can't remember which country he was an ambassador for, he started liquidating his holdings. And so he sold the mall. And so we sold our portion at the time as well. So we're not involved in the mall anymore, but over the years.
Again, there's that thread of Bruce Stucki and your family through all of this.
And all of that property that surrounds the mall and heading south, there were about 250 acres that were there. And so Boulevard Home Furnishings, where the Vasa Fitness is, where the Wells Fargo Bank, all that, and south on Mall Drive, and several developments. Actually, that's where I came in, as I helped develop the commercial south of the mall, as well as the residential subdivisions and so on, in partnership with Ents.
So, Brad, let's drop back again. I think it's to the 1960s and talk about Dixie Aviation.
Okay, yes. I know that you've already talked with the Atkins, and I've listened to that episode, and it's essentially what they said. However, I'll go back a little bit further from SkyWest to the origins. Dad always had a lot of energy. In fact, Mom always teased him he had more energy than sense. But he had a lot of energy, and when he came back, he was interested in flying. So he joined a flying club and got his pilot's license, and he thought, maybe I can make this pay a little bit, and so he applied to be the manager of the St. George Airport. And if he was going to be the manager of the St. George Airport, there's probably a demand for an airline, a commuter service going out of St. George. And he bought essentially 5 planes, and 2 high-wing planes, and then the rest low-wing planes with also an Aero Commander. And so he did scenic flights over the Grand Canyon and Lake Powell and so on, and charged a fee for that and hired pilots. And then he had the commuter route with mainly from St. George to Salt Lake and back. And in fact, Earl Snow was one of the pilots that worked for Dad and then became a pilot for SkyWest through all his career. But then it got really busy with Rocky Mountain as they were expanding. And again, he had lots of energy, lots of ideas, and so on. And this is also kind of the time of Dixie development, the inception of that. So he had a lot of things going. And I remember as a kindergartner and pre-kindergartner, Mom would go up and run the airport in the mornings. And she would take me because I was the youngest at the time, and I would ride a tricycle out on the runway up on the Black Hill. And she'd get on the loudspeaker and say, "Brad, get off the runway, there's a plane coming in." And so I'd pull my tricycle off from the runway, watch the plane come down and land. Then I'd get back on the runway and ride my tricycle. And then we'd go down to A&W and get a kids' meal kind of thing. And then I'd go to kindergarten and then walk home. And it got so busy, Dad had the ideas of bringing in an air show. And they brought in an air show and did flyovers and things like that up at the airport. And they did air rallies as well. And my older brother, Wayne and Mike, actually their first jobs were fueling planes at the airport. Really? So
sounds like quite a family affair.
The thing that is funny, and Mom tells it like this, that it got so busy that Mom said that you can either sell the airport or sell me. And she said that Dad got an offer for the airport first. So that's why he sold the airport to the doctors that the Atkins talked about, and they tried to run the airline, and it started to falter, so Dad would take it back, and they'd do it again, and so on, and eventually it got to where Dad sold it to the Atkins. And at that point, it was just on life support, just because of how it needs attention for something like that.
Your dad had a vision up there that was awesome.
In fact, he was the original life flight pilot.
Really?
A lot of times when they had a lot of the life flight needs, he would fly the injured people up to Salt Lake and so on. In fact, he got to a point where he asked Mom to make curtains for the aircraft so that the sun wouldn't come in and be in their faces and so on.
So I thought I had the idyllic boyhood growing up on 600 South, but you were up there riding was it your trike?
My tricycle, yeah.
You're riding your trike on the runway up on the airport. I can't imagine anything more exotic or adventurous than that.
And I would make my own handmade kites and go on the edge of the ridge there behind where the old terminal was, and the wind was just perfect. That would come up and it would make the kite fly and so on. I just had a great time.
My goodness. As you're sharing all of this, Brad, it just brings home this whole idea of what we've been talking about in all these podcasts, is how people came here. We came here and we made it work.
And it was a lot of people that joined together.
Exactly. We're talking about your dad, but in all of these initiatives, there were other key people.
Everybody would buy in and go along with it.
But it started out of a dugout in the side of a hill and has become what it is. And there's something really special about that. I know there's something really special about your father and mother. Why don't you talk about their characteristics, their attributes, and what it is that made all this possible?
Yeah, I really credit my mom a lot. Dad was driven and had a lot of energy, and sometimes he was very intense. And so Mom would have to remind him, smile, be nice, and so on. And she was more refined and made sure that we, learned manners and so on throughout our growing up. But Dad could not have done the things that he did without her really carrying a lot of the load at home. And Dad provided well, and at times, you always hear, wait till your dad gets home. Well, Mom was the primary disciplinarian unless it was really bad. I remember breaking several paddle boards over my backside from some of the things I did, but that was from Mom, not Dad. She was equally hard worker, but very refined and nice. But she also has a real sense of humor. While I was growing up, I was continually embarrassed by my mother because she was the Wicked Witch of the East, and Dolores, her sister Dolores Blake, that lived in Santa Clara, was the Wicked Witch of the West. And they would go around and do firesides and talk about how to be a mean mom and how that was the way to be. She walked the walk. But we knew we were loved and so on. But again, anytime she could, she would embarrass me. In fact, she did one fireside with her sister at Dixie College at the time for the Institute. And I was there at the time. And she made a big deal about taking applications for my future wife. And then she had a T-shirt that she held up and said that I've already rated Brad on different qualifications and check. And then she held up a pink shirt. The other was a blue and said, if you want this pink shirt that would match, just come up and fill out this application. And I had no idea what she was going to do, but it was very embarrassing.
Oh, your mom and Dolores Blake, what great ladies. And they really do embody that Dixie spirit.
Yeah.
Just through and through. And the proof's in the pudding. The wonderful families they raised and their posterity is so great.
Thank you. We owe a lot to our heritage.
Maybe that's how we could bring this full circle, Brad, is to talk maybe just a little bit more about that heritage and this thing we call the Dixie spirit. Because I believe that everything we've talked about today is part of that Dixie spirit, how we came here and how we've built what we built and where we are right now and how so much of that comes from the past.
And that's very true because in order to survive the settlements down here, they all had to work together, whether it was Santa Clara, St. George, or Washington, Bunkerville, Logandale, any of these communities, they had to work together, and they tended to band together when they wanted something big to do. And for the benefit of the community, they would band together to do that. And that is what I would say is a large part of the Dixie spirit. If people think this is something that would be important for our community, then people, will get behind it and they'll sacrifice. Another example that I heard about after the fact, I was not involved in it, but I heard about it after the fact from other people. When they were first building the Dixie Center, the college campus, they were running into funding issues and they were running out of funds. And so Dad and a group of people got together and said, look, we can do this. We don't need the money. We'll just get donations from people and they'll donate work, they'll donate time, they'll donate funds and so on. And so they got a group of people together in the community that believed in the project and they finished it. And that's the Dixie spirit.
It is. And it's still paying dividends today. I think about what I shared about my dad and that stock that he bought 60 years ago. And then those dividends came later. And we live in a place where people have planted seeds all through the generations and we're the beneficiaries of the fruit of all of that seed.
And all through that, they never talked about the money. It was they're doing it because it was the right thing to do, and it would benefit a lot of people.
That's true. I come back to, would John Stucki be your great-grandfather?
Great-great-grandfather.
Grandfather. Yeah. Think about him at 10 years old, crossing the plains and so hungry and eating off that roast that's on the back of the hand cart, and just imagining him at that point and then trying to imagine what he would think of all of this now. But it all stemmed from him and from so many others just like him.
Yeah, they all worked together, and they all worked very hard.
I think maybe that's the key to everything we've talked about today. Work, hard work.
Yeah.
Just that joy in hard work.
Yeah.
Brad, thank you.
It's been a real pleasure and an honor to be part of this. Thank you.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The hot winds whirl around me and take away my breath. I've had the chills and fever till I'm nearly shook to death. All earthly tribulations are but a moment here. And oh, if I prove faithful, a righteous crown I'll wear. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. I hope that there's a heaven with rivers pure and clean, but I know